Okay, Shirin Neshat. I'm curious, how familiar are you guys with Neshat and her practice? At the same time, she was all over New York, same time as Schoenberg. Has anybody seen her work before? This is a little bit, I'm gonna be honest, this is a challenging one because she's really a filmmaker. And I've noticed the selection of global contemporary, I mean, you're working with a textbook, images in a textbook, and so there's very little in the way of temporal arts, but they have been enormously important in the contemporary period. So we'll talk about this work and its context. I do have, like we can look at one of her videos that's shorter. They tend aesthetically to be very similar to the photographs. They're black and white, they're symmetrical, they're elegant, usually 2 screens. So you read them sort of together simultaneously. Usually no dialogue, although I understand she just made a feature film, which does have lots of dialogue. And they're all set in a Middle Eastern context, an Islamic context in which women all wear veils. So she grew up in a liberal family in Iran. She went to a Catholic school. So from a young age, she had variety in her religious upbringing. She moved to California in 1975 as a teenager, and she stayed there. She did her MFA in the US, and 4 years after she moved to the US, the Iranian Revolution happened. So it was 20 years before she went home. So this is one thing that is really important to keep in mind. Like Yinka Schoenberg, she is an artist who is not simply living in Iran or living in Nigeria. She's back and forth between a major Western center and one of these locations that we call global because they're not a part of the sort of Western central narrative. And this is something that we do see quite a bit of. Somebody like Shirin Neshat, somebody like Ai Weiwei, who if you're here for the second session, we'll be talking about, one of the things that makes them popular is that they speak to a Western audience in very specific ways. Now, there are aspects of Neshat's practice that are not necessarily accessible. You need to be able to read Farsi to know what the text is on her face, for instance. And when there are certain sort of coded references, but again, she is very much a hybrid artist culturally. When she finally returned to Iran, it had become law that women had to cover their heads. So this is a really significant change in how women's lives play out in Iran. And so she returned to the United States and she was engaged very much with the veil and the iconography of the veil. Now, I'm curious, what, nobody here is wearing any head covering. What do they mean to you? When you see a woman who has her head covered, who's wearing a hijab, how does that read? Does that signify anything, or is it just clothes?
Otherness. Religious piety or devotion.
Okay.
Modesty.
Sorry? Modesty.
Sometimes oppression. Yeah.
Sorry? A political statement. This is quite a range on this from this front table. Yeah. I mean, what the head covering means has changed over the last 10 years in really substantial ways. The politics of the hijab have changed in really significant ways. You guys probably don't, I wouldn't expect any of you to follow Canadian politics closely, but the last election there, people have suggested was won as a result of a debate over the wearing of burqas. The standing government, the incumbent, was like, we're going to outlaw burqas, no more burqas. And the person who won was like, that's not us. We don't do that here. And won by a landslide. Not exclusively on that, but increasingly this sense that these are political objects. But that issue of modesty is really important. For those of you who are a little uncomfortable with the head covering or unfamiliar with it culturally, just sort of ask yourself, what piece of clothing would I not go outside without? What part of my body do I need to cover to be comfortable? For most of us, unless you live in a nudist colony, There are parts of our bodies we feel like we need to cover, and there's an enormous cultural range in what we feel like we need to cover. So just to sort of foreground the sense that she's using it in a very politicized way in the 90s. And what it means today, it has changed. But I think it's important, especially when we teach this material, to be sensitive to the complexities of what it means to cover one's head today. So this is this collection of works, the Women of Allah series. To give you a sense of context, it was the first major body of work that she made after her return from Iran when she visited. So tell me about these images. What do they evoke for you, first of all? Because they are provocative. What do they make you feel?
They all have a weapon or a gun. So
Yes. They all have weapons, they all have text, they all have, to one degree or another, the sort of references to the head covering, and they all have flesh, like they all share these things.
If, as a man, I can say they look defensive rather than militaristic, I guess.
Okay.
Other than that bottom one where the gun's pointed
at you.
With the hands.
Yeah, which you stand in for.
Oh,
Yes.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Still defensive, I see.
Huh. Okay. Yeah.
They're all black and white, so it kind of feels like a journalistic documentary style program.
Okay, the sense that it's telling you some truth or offering a kind of document for posterity. Did anybody come across the Los Angeles Times call for a Mideast reporter? Look it up when you go home. It's hilarious. The Los Angeles Times was hiring, maybe they found somebody, a Mideast correspondent. And just, they were like, it would be good if you could speak Arabic. And we want someone who can capture the vibrancy and brutality of these ancient cultures. And it's like, come on, guys, come on. You're a newspaper. Anyways, they were roundly mocked for it. It's worth looking up. In this case, I think it is more hilarious than distressing because people took it on and challenged that representation of a part of the world that is as much modern as this one, right? The Middle East doesn't exist in a different time period than our own, and that's a thing that can be really challenging. There's a really good essay, Nelson, I'm forgetting the first name, that looks at the way that art history curriculums break down time and place, and that we do so in really inconsistent ways. You'd noted that the only other global section is the ancient world. And then often the ancient often gets sort of grouped in with, like, say, indigenous art from 100 years ago. So we do want to keep in mind this is all happening at the same time. Nobody's less modern, really. We're all modern together. Did you have?
There's something about her work that, to me, I don't know how to explain it. You know, we have a long history of writing on skin.
Sorry?
We have a long history of writing on skin.
Yes.
Parchment.
Yeah.
To me, there's something brutal or disturbing about writing on the human skin.
That there's something invasive about it. Now she writes on the photographs, is my understanding. In particular,
yeah, that one. So she doesn't write
on the actual body, on her own or her model's body. But that sense that it is this sort of covering, it's another layer of covering over, of making invisible the skin underneath the text.
One thing that I was going to add, it was mentioned that these photos look defensive, and my reaction was actually the opposite, because I thought it's this weird juxtaposition of beauty. Like, she's very beautiful, very beautiful, softness of skin, and even like a woman in a hijab. I mean, I think when I see them, I mean, we mentioned, it was mentioned oppression, but I don't see them as like intimidating or anything like that, but maybe following this, it's either rule of modesty or choosing this rule of modesty.
Right.
But then that's juxtaposed with a gun and a very, powerful gun, especially in her first one. The first time that I saw that photo, I thought, she looks so peaceful and calm and beautiful.
In this one.
Yeah, and yet she has this, for me, what is a symbol of violence with her. And so that I'm curious, you might be getting this, is there this message here of those two things put together?
Absolutely. And one of the things, and then we have this sort of dichotomy, this splitting, but she wants to get at the fact that these kinds of divisions are oversimplified. It's more complicated. We are more complicated than gentle or violent, young or old, east or west. She wants to start drawing us into this field of ambiguity. And one of the ways that happens is one of the least accessible aspects of this project, which is the writing. So we can't read it if we don't read Farsi. But these are all texts by Iranian women, poets. And there's an enormous range. So one of these poems is by a feminist who objects to these new laws that force her to cover her head, that have changed her life. And then another one is about the glory of martyrdom in the name of God. There is this real range. So she wants us to get at this sense of ambiguity. That said, both the photographs and her films do tend to really go for these dualities. We get this especially in the two screens, the doubled screen, the black and white. She does offer us opposites. But one of the things that we see happening is that the way that we read those messages really vary. Are these women who are defending themselves? Are they there to protect themselves? Are they aggressors? Are they militants? Have they been forced into positions of violent engagement? We don't have that information. I do want to talk, so the fact, what does it mean, do you think, that she is relying on female writers? Why only female writers? What does that say to you?
Give me a voice.
Okay, giving a voice to women. And there is certainly, and the video that we'll watch is very much about this restriction on women's speech, and in particular musically, in terms of musical performance. So she's giving a voice to women. She's also advocating a feminist politics, right? She is a feminist. And the practice of wearing the veil, of wearing a head covering of whatever kind, has a really complicated relationship with feminism. On the one hand, there's this idea, it's oppressive, right? It covers women, it silences them, it shames them. On the other hand, how can it be read as a feminist practice?
They choose. This is a statement that they can make about who they are and what they want to do.
All right, good. Anybody want to expand on that, the ways in which this might tie into a feminist politics? Yes?
They're not being read as sexual objects. They are being, they're taking control of their modesty.
Yes. We have a very long history of the objectification of women. What do we mean when we say objectification? Sexualization, and also just in a really literal way, seeing a person as an object, as a thing, rather than as a subject, a feeling, thinking, acting person. Instead, they become a thing who is enjoyed for their visual qualities. For many contemporary Muslim women, especially in Western nations, this is a way of blocking that view. Right? My value is not in my beauty or lack thereof. Who I am as a person is not how I look. It's not whether I've got good hair or the shape of my body. It's how I act. It's what I say. It's what I think. Right? So this is sort of a part of the tradition that we're working with here. So again, we need to go back to colonial history. It's really difficult to look at most global contemporary without acknowledging colonial histories. So the scramble for Africa included North Africa, and we also have the various attempts to take parts of the Middle East. Napoleon's mission into Egypt, which was a fantastic disaster. They wore wool to Egypt, those silly French soldiers. But it was also framed as an information gathering mission. So there's this new way with Napoleon and the Enlightenment, there's a new way of seeing the Orient. Okay, and the Orient here is this all-encompassing term that refers to, like, what is included in the Orient?
Not me.
Basically, not me. Lots of, not the Americas, not most of Africa, but North Africa gets sort of clumped in. Sorry?
North African Asia.
Yes, yes. And then various islands scattered throughout the oceans of the world get lumped into the Orient. And for many occupying forces, there was a real interest in these exotic covered women, right? You go to this other country, you're like, oh, I'm getting away from the staid, boring, repressive culture of Europe, and I'm going to go to this place where, there are harems. And men have they can have all the women, and you get there and all the women are covered up and staying inside, and there's no access. So artists like Delacroix, they go and they paint these paintings. Oh, the beautiful women of Algiers, they're so beautiful, they're so sexy. There's no way he was hanging out with them. He just would not have been allowed into their quarters. So there is this sense of a sort of fantasy and a desire for this unattainable, sexualized, exotic female body. And this is a great example. So, I mean, what makes her exotic besides her weirdly long spine? Okay, so she's wearing a turban. She's got a fan. There's this sort of these decadent fabrics.
Drugs.
Her opium pipe up on the side. So did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. So she's this incredibly eroticized figure. She basically fulfills European expectations of beauty with the trappings of otherness. And these kinds of representations, especially of Middle Eastern and Muslim women, were very desirable in the 19th century in Europe. Representations of Muslim women and uncovered Muslim women become even more complicated when we move into photography. So Dennis Adams he took the documentation from these photographs that were taken in Algeria, French-occupied Algeria in the 1960s, when the French government demanded that all women remove their head coverings for photographic documentation purposes. So, I mean, this is would have been very distressing. Just again, imagine yourself going in to have your driver's license photograph, and you have to get one. You don't have a choice. You must go and get this ID. And if you're a woman, you're being asked to do it with your top off, right? I mean, it's really, sorry, did you have a?
Just would you go back to when that happened?
The 1960s in French-occupied Algeria. So it's right towards the end of the French occupation of Algeria. And so Dennis Adams collects these photographs and he covers them. He makes a book where photographs of this war-torn region are layered over women's faces, which I think it's a great example of the ways in which artists are thinking about this issue of covering and modesty in colonial contexts. So just some background on the way that she's using it. That for Neshat, the head covering implies both oppression and liberation from a very different kind of oppression, from objectification.